There's concern among some provinces that Canada could be falling behind in trade talks with the Americans as the U.S. kicks off negotiations with Mexico alone.
I'm not asking them to talk more. I want them to sit down and negotiate and get a good deal for Quebec and Canada. So I'm not asking for anything in particular. I'm waiting to see results.
I have a lot of concern with respect to the CUSMA deal and where we are going to find our way on that in the next while. And it needs to really be all of our talents and all of our efforts, whether that be provincially supporting the federal government in that negotiation or engaging ourselves directly with the U.S. administration.
Plus, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre wrapping up a trip throughout the United States, selling the value of Canada-U.S. trade with bilateral relations on shaky ground, including on The Joe Rogan Show, a podcast with a huge audience and a controversial host.
So I think it's in America's interest to come towards a tariff-free deal and trade freely as friends, and that will be good for both of us.
Have you had conversations with Trump about this?
No. I believe in the rule of one prime minister at a time. So I fought like hell to win. I didn't win. We came very close. So I've said, listen, I'll leave it to the prime minister to do the negotiating. And I've said I'll support him any way I can. Even in my visit down here, I'm sending him text messages to tell him what's going on, to try and support his work, because what we both want what's best for Canada.
The Political Pulse panel is here to weigh in. Greg McEachran is a former Liberal ministerial advisor. Fred Delory is a former Conservative campaign manager. And Melanie Richer is a former communications director for the NDP. Hi, guys. Nice to see you all. Thanks for being here. Fred, I'll start with you. How do you think Poilievre did this week?
I think it was excellent. I think a lot of risk going on this podcast.
Sure.
The Stan Rogers song that kept playing in my head was "Make and Break Harbor." What's going to happen here? Could he make or break himself? He didn't break himself. Obviously, time will tell. There's no there's lots of pollsters out talking about the impact right away. None of that actually matters. We're years away from an election. But I thought he looked really good. I thought his comments about Canada were very strong. I had maple syrup in my coffee this morning instead of sugar. Trying different things that was discussed.
Learn something.
But just the whole conversation was good, and how he was really championing Canada to a U.S. audience, but also obviously a Canadian audience, where this is still the top podcast listened to in Canada. So there's an audience here and an audience there, and I think it was very strong on both points on how he delivered it. So, I'm sure there was lots of internal debate on whether he goes on the show. I'm sure it's been happening for a while. During the last election, there was chatter of him going on it. It made perfect sense for him to go on, and I think he did a very, very good job by doing so.
Did you pick up any kettlebells after?
No, I'm seeing lots of fellow Conservatives doing that. I'm not quite there yet.
All right. Greg, how do you think Poilievre did on this podcast? I mean, it's, Joe Rogan, controversial figure, but as Fred points out, just a massive audience. There's like 20 million subscribers on YouTube to this show. Was it worth it?
Well, 80% of those subscribers are in the United States. That's not to say he doesn't have a significant audience in Canada, but we don't really have a concept of going on that show to help you politically in Canada. And I agree with Fred. There's no harm, no foul. He did seem very nervous at first. Joe Rogan, for a guy who was like the 5th billed person on news radio and made contestants eat insects on Fear Factor, has done very well. He's worth about $250 million American, had a huge deal with Spotify. But he also has been in a lot of trouble for things like using the N-word, some very controversial takes. He often, you can find where he's said things where it's very easily corrected. He said some things about MAID that I find a bit problematic. So I'm not sure in terms of Mr. Poilievre's current issues, in terms of the fact that he's polling really poorly, and that used to be just he head-to-head with the Prime Minister, but the party's he's a drag on the party. I'm not quite sure where that helps him. Now, post-politics, if he is looking for a career in the United States to be a speaker at conservative events, like this could be very helpful for him. But the one thing that I think there's a lot of pundits and media people who have been very tough on Mr. Poilievre, deservedly so, perhaps, and are very complimentary of this because it does seem like an effort. But the medium is the message, and the part that I really that I have a bit of an issue with is when Joe Rogan talked about Fidel Castro and pretending that it was the last prime minister's father. to me, I find that disgusting. I don't want to seem like I'm being prudish here, but if that happened to you and somebody was going to make those claims about your parentage, when it's so easily disproved, and the initial read that I saw was that Mr. Poilievre pushed back, and I was like, well, great, that's really good.
Yeah, he shot that down.
But then when I actually watched it, it's dealt with very, very funny. He says, I don't think so. And again, you chose to go on this platform. This is who you're playing with, and that's not something that I'm super happy about.
Mel?
I think it's a year too late. A lot of the messages that he had in there, would have been probably, I'm glad he didn't say them in the last campaign, but it would have been good to hear some of the messages that he had to say, reaffirming Canada's place, talking about how, what's happening with the U.S. is not helpful to Americans or to Canadians. I think that probably would have helped him in the last campaign. I also think if you're going to do this kind of thing, you got to take the risk before the campaign. There were rumors about him being invited last year that it seemed like he said no to go now when nobody really is paying attention because we're not going to be in an election anytime soon. I don't really know why you're doing this. To his credit, he didn't take Joe Rogan's bait, and there was quite a few opportunities to do that, and he seemed, to be a little bit reserved there and to seem to handle himself well. To me, it's like it's another part of this. Maybe finally we're seeing the shift in tone a little bit from Pierre Poilievre in the last month after hearing about it for the last year, going to Europe, going to the States, trying to be more of an ally to the Prime Minister. But if I'm the Prime Minister, I don't really want your help. I don't think I need it at this point. Not that he doesn't need it. Obviously, we do. I don't think it's particularly helpful. But I think that this is to Poilievre's benefit for sure. He's trying to set himself up to be a little bit more serious in the face of the Prime Minister. I just think it's too little, too late at this point, and he could have done this in the lead up to the last election.
Fred, what do you make of his sort of deferential tone to the Prime Minister? Saying, I text with him, I've been keeping him up to date on what's going on with this U.S. tour, not criticizing him when on foreign soil. Like, he is not tearing a strip off him, right? He's saying, like, we actually have mutual respect for one another. That's what he claimed on that podcast yesterday.
It's absolutely what a leader of the opposition should do when they're on foreign soil. When they're outside of the country, there should be that collective understanding that we're all pro-Canada and doing what we can for Canada. So I think it makes perfect sense that he's doing that. Here at home, when he's in Parliament, he's going to be quite a bit different on that. But I think it would have been terrible if he went the other way on that. But it goes to, and we're talking about, should he have done this last year or something? Yeah, I think that could have been, the message we've been saying then at the same time. Like, he should go out there and push these sorts of things. He didn't. That race is over. That election's over. We are 1, 2, 3 years away from the next election. There is time for him to rebuild. I remember when I first met Stephen Harper, he was at 9% in the polls, and he went on to be Canada's 6th longest serving Prime Minister, so I just would not count this guy out yet.
Greg, do you think it puts more pressure on the Prime Minister to be more active on the U.S. file? Because obviously he's done a lot on trade diversification. He's just in India and Australia, and he's been with the Nordic countries and the UK. But really, we haven't heard much about trade or CUSMA or what's going on with the bilateral negotiations. We saw Mexico sitting down with the Americans this week, Canada not yet in the picture. Does Carney have to be more attentive to this relationship now that Poilievre's staken out this ground?
Do I think a Joe Rogan podcast means the Prime Minister has to do that? No.
Well, he's just been more active meeting with all these folks in the United States.
A couple of weeks ago, Dominic LeBlanc was there. I don't think so. Look, I'm very mindful that Cuba could go under as a country at this moment. There's no electricity. People are in huge danger there. The President of the United States has gotten us into major trouble in Iran and doesn't seem to know what he's doing. So in the bigger picture, no.
Mel, do you think that, as I mentioned, trade diversification front and center, the U.S. relationship sort of on the back burner? That's politically driven, I think, in part because Canada wants to take a step back from the U.S. right now. But we have Poilievre saying, hey, let's not forget about the Americans. They're still our largest market. Let's try and build these relationships up. Do you think that there's renewed pressure on the government to deliver something on CUSMA, to get down there to Washington and start this review process?
I don't know if there's renewed pressure, just because I don't think that that's where the public pulse is right now. When you take a look at polling, when you take a look at public polling, you see that folks still give the Prime Minister a lot of empathy for dealing with the United States, particularly with the president. I think a lot of Canadians are a little bit exhausted by what's happening in the U.S. I don't think they want us to walk away from the U.S., but they are taking a look at the Prime Minister to diversify those relationships, and that's what they're seeing him do. And again, when you take a look at what countries Canadians think are our biggest enemy right now, the U.S. is one of those.
Yeah,
so that's why it's a little bit tricky, and why I think the Prime Minister still has a little bit of room to do what he's doing and kind of work on the U.S. on the side of, not the side of the desk, but to work on it, sustainably, because things don't seem to be moving. That being said, I think the more you see the job numbers that we saw last month, the more you see folks having a hard time with, their bills, with their cost of living, I think the more people are going to realize how this breakdown in relationship is harming Canadians. Not that they don't already know, they see it, but they don't feel it in the same way that they might, and that may add the pressure. I think that will be, what changes the tune for the Prime Minister, less so, what Pierre Poilievre is doing.
Fred, does it worry you when USTR Jamieson Greer says Canada's lagging behind? We're moving ahead with the Mexicans. We've had this week-long discussion in Washington. We haven't heard much from the Canadians. They're not moving on the things we want them to move on. Does that cause concern for you?
I'm not sure to say if any American causes me concern or doesn't cause me concern. Every time they talk, it's a bit concerning.
Fair enough.
The government has a very tough job here to do, and you cannot negotiate in public, so we don't know what's going on. We shouldn't know what's going on, because anytime you raise anything, anytime it goes out, the other side will hammer us over the head with it. So we've got this very difficult relationship, but we've got these two things moving very quickly towards us right now. One is the economy about to head off the cliff? Are we about to lose lots of jobs? Is all this going to happen? At the same time, is Prime Minister Carney getting things done? Is he trying to get things built and our trade diversified? And I know it feels like that's certainly what they are focused on trying to do, and that's what they can control what you can control. So we'll see how this all plays out in the next year or so, but am I worried? I'm always worried every time they talk.
Fair enough. And there was some harsh words today from Donald Trump on something else, on NATO today. Of course, he was calling allies cowards in a social media post. He's criticizing them for not answering his calls for assistance and defending the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran, of course, has blocked since the war began. Canada's position has been that it will not play an offensive role in the war, though yesterday Canada signed on to a joint statement by leaders of 7 countries signaling a willingness to help reopen the strait, saying they will pursue appropriate efforts to do so. The statement does not say how the countries would play a role in all this, but CBC News has asked for clarification and received this response from the Foreign Affairs Minister's office. Any potential support would be guided by the needs on the ground, Canada's legal and policy frameworks, and ongoing consultations with partners and allies. All right, so Greg, what do you make of this? We don't want to play a role offensively, but it seems like Anita Anand, the Foreign Affairs Minister, is opening the door to some sort of role for Canada in unblocking the Strait of Hormuz. What do you make of that?
There are allies who are talking right now about what they can do to mitigate this damage that President Trump has done. They're probably not having those conversations with the United States. And I like Minister Anand's statement there, because I am by no means a foreign affairs expert, but the 3 things that she lists there, when she talks about the legal and policy frameworks, working with our allies, what is the need on the ground? Watching politics for, a couple of decades, that seems to be what it normally would happen. Used to be led by countries like the United States. The president is talking, he's angry at NATO, and NATO stands for North Atlantic. And that strait seems, I have a big atlas that I got for my birthday last year, and that strait's pretty far from the North Atlantic. He also said, and this really gets under my skin, and I have to be like, this is where I worry, I'm going to swear. So when he said that, NATO allies, Canada was not anywhere near the front line in Afghanistan, and we lost a lot of men and women there. Yeah. And you cannot be surprised that if you insult your friends and allies, and when you get yourself into trouble, no one's coming for you. This is all on them. And the more that his secretaries, when you talked about, in terms of the trade deal, you asked Fred if he gets scared. I mean, these are unreliable narrators, that whole administration, and you're just going to start to watch them being picked off one by one. We've seen Nome gone. There's rumors about how long Tulsi Gabbard will be there. I think that, it's just a matter of time. And the challenge is, what are the other countries going to do when the cleanup starts?
Mel?
Yeah, it's hard to say when you take a look at, or not hard to say, but I can't stop thinking of you've got an unreliable narrator, and not only an unreliable narrator, but this seemed to have come from nowhere. It seemed to have been something done impulsively. I'm sure it wasn't as much as it seemed so. But I think you mentioned earlier in your first response, the not making sure that your allies are with you before you do something, and then expecting them to show up when you've spent the last year, saying you're going to invade Canada, you're going to invade Greenland. I don't know how you expect to then have people lining up and joining you. I don't think Canadians want us to go to war. I don't think even Americans wanted the president to go to the war. So to convince, the Canadian people to ally themselves, and not just to ally themselves with the country, but to ally themselves with Donald Trump and the U.S. when they've spent the last year feeling like they're being, attacked by the Americans, I don't think is something that the Prime Minister would have an easy time communicating to the Canadian people. So it's hard to see where this goes, but it's not hard to understand the government's response on this.
Yeah, Fred, is there a risk of just getting involved at all, right? Because obviously it's kind of not a great political move right now to get associated with anything Trump's doing, at least from a Canadian perspective. But is there a risk politically if Canada does band together with allies to try and clear the Strait of Hormuz? Would that be seen in this country as somehow aligning with Trump or being part of his war effort? Or is there a way to kind of sell that as just economically necessary for the global order?
I think that's the selling point there, and it's about being neutral in this conflict too, right? You're just trying to keep the peace in an area, a small area that needs to move through this. I will say it is great to see Canada in headlines again, though, actually as part of the allies that are talking about. There's been so many years we've just been left out of the conversation. So the fact that we're back in it, I think, says a lot too about where we are and the leadership vacuum that is creating in the free world right now with what Trump's been doing. What's going on in Iran, we all have different views on that and whether that should be going ahead. But I do think there is a role for Canada to play in just keeping it the strait open.
Greg, there was some complaints from Liberal backbenchers when Carney came out initially to support the strikes to neuter, if you will, the Iranian nuclear program. Some of the more progressive types, I think, within the party. Is there an issue moving forward for the Prime Minister when he's dealing with this issue? Does he have caucus concerns on his mind as he's thinking about how much he should participate in something like this?
I think this has been discussed a couple of times, that the lens that he probably said the initial statements with, the initial statements that he said, he probably would not have done again. He clarified them. I think there was a couple of factors, other side of the world, it happened on a weekend. We're 3 weeks into this. This is, and it was supposed to last extremely, like a very short period of time. Conrad Black said it'd only be 10 days. He said that on March 1st. We're a lot past that now. But on the caucus element of things, I think, it might have been a learning for the Prime Minister. But also, the opposite is, if you squish that down and you don't allow that, it just festers and it's going to come up at another time and it's going to be worse. Let that venting happen. And if you have to learn in terms of like caucus management, but I like the fact there were very, very different parties and the makeup is different. That is the Liberal Party. You want to have a broad spectrum of views, and you don't want, trained seals.
Mel, how does the NDP factor into all this? Because I think Avi Lewis, if he takes the leadership, or either Heather McPherson, they're probably less gung-ho about Canada being involved in some sort of military effort overseas, even if it's in a defensive position. Do you think that would be a topic for discussion in the House of Commons when they return next week, maybe pressing the government on how far they're willing to go to play some sort of role in this conflict?
So I definitely think that there's a transparency and an accountability factor that the NDP should be focused on. But I would prefer, to be frank, that they focus on, the cost of living and to focus on, not that this isn't important and I don't want to dismiss it, but I would love to see, caucus under a new leader coming in and taking up the space that has been left by the Prime Minister being so focused on the economy, so focused on diversifying trade and, forgetting working people. I think that there is a massive opportunity for the party to take up that space, and I think that's the space to take up for them. As it relates to the communication of it all, I hear you on, letting folks vent, but I do think that that's a lesson in caucus management of you talk to your people before you say the thing. And we've seen this with him a few times, that if you're not, talking to your people, figuring out where people are, not that you need to, have a statement that makes everybody happy. That's not the point. But if you're hearing people out ahead of time, I think you're mitigating that a lot more, which is maybe something that the Prime Minister is learning as he has his feet under the job.
100%, because these people are on your team, and if they don't understand or are surprised, they're not able to be, effective ambassadors, for lack of a better word, for you.
Yeah, like Will Greaves from Victoria. I'm sure he was getting an earful from his constituents, right? The rookie Liberal MP who represents that riding. He was one of the people that came out with this statement to say, hold on a second, this might be in violation of international law. Let's not be cheerleading necessarily for the U.S. campaign against Iran. Fred, let's just take a step back and go over again Trump's comments about the cowards, NATO allies being cowards. Do you think that this complicates how Carney moves forward with his relationship with Trump, with NATO? Like, how can NATO, to Greg's earlier point, how can NATO really be a functioning alliance if you have the President of the United States denigrating allies at every turn, using such bombastic language, very insulting, dismissing the contributions of NATO allies in the Afghan conflict? Like, genuinely, how does NATO kind of deal with any issue whatsoever when you got someone like that as a member?
I think they got to remember it's temporary. NATO's been around for decades and decades and will continue to be, where the president is only here for a few more years, and I think there will be a drastic change when he leaves. So it's about getting through this period. But calling NATO cowards, he started a trade war with his closest ally, both geographically and financially and economically and culturally, and then trade wars with all these other countries. And now he's looking at them for help. He started this mess, and he doesn't have the friends that the U.S. used to have. The relationships will come back. The relationships will be rebuilt. We share a massive border with them. They are culturally very tied to us and us to them. The relationship will rebuild, but it's going to take time and it's going to take leadership change.
Do you think the Conservatives will stake out a position on the Strait of Hormuz? Because we really haven't heard much.
It's a very niche issue that
niche.
is hard. Like, sure, it makes sense. We should be in there as a neutral actor with our other allies, trying to keep that open. It's a massive, as you pointed out, a massive part of the global economy is dependent on that strait being open. But it doesn't mean involving yourself in the actual war. Yeah. You can be there without actually, going into Iran and participating.
Greg, maybe this is just not really a political issue at all. Like, maybe it's like when initially this conflict started, we thought, okay, maybe there's going to be different positions on how this all plays out. But now that we've seen it kind of unfold over the last few weeks, and I'm listening to you guys, maybe there isn't really a political issue here at all. It's just like, yeah, let's send some military equipment, some personnel will help clear the Strait of Hormuz. There'll be nothing there to see. Like, is that how this is going to go? Like, everyone's just going to go along?
Yeah,
and
I sincerely doubt it, and I think it's a very political issue. Look, I talked to someone this afternoon who is an Iranian who's been in our country for 4 years. And are they happy about the leadership being decimated? Absolutely. But are they concerned about their relatives and friends who are still there and what happens now? Absolutely. And because the president has no plan for this. So I think that's the big challenge. In terms of going back to normal, I think there is a consideration among the other countries that after Trump's first season and Biden came in, everyone acted like everything is going to be righted. And you look at people like George W. Bush and Bill Clinton getting along now, but Trump does not behave like that. So the fear for a lot of these countries is, okay, the Constitution says that Trump can't run again. Hopefully that is what happens. But what happens to the remainder of that party? Is this now, even if the Democrats take the House and they may even take the Senate, in the midterms, how much will this really, is America changed forever? Pete Buttigieg was in town, former Secretary of Transportation for Biden, one of the most effective Democratic communicators, goes on Fox News. And when he was here, he spoke and he said, there's a lot of pressure on Democrats to say we're going to rebuild everything and we're going to put all the broken pieces back together again. And he said the first thing we have to acknowledge is that things weren't working for everybody before. And why would we put them back together that way? That's why we lost. And I think so. This rupture may be, I hope, I love my American cousins, but I think this is going to leave a long-term mark. Mel, final word to you.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens with the conflict and how Canada responds. But to your point, I kind of agree. You want, obviously, the relationship to rebuild, and it will. To your point, Fred, that'll take time. It is hard to see how it ever looks the way that it did before, because I think Canadians now know how important it is to be able to rely on our industries, on our economy, to isolate or to protect from something like that happening again. But obviously, with time, you do hope, to be able to rebuild for sure.
We all got over the War of 1812, so
all of us, yes, all of us.
Long-term.
Time heals.
How old you are, Fred.
Time heals all wounds, is what you're saying. All right, well, maybe we got 200 years to go until things are back on track. All right, thank you so much, guys. Greg McEachran, Fred Delory, and Melanie Richer. Nice to see you all.